What's going on here? The millionaire saw the nanny teaching ballet to his daughter. A millionaire used to controlling every aspect of his daughter's life, never expected to find the nanny teaching ballet steps in the living room. Caught between surprise and emotion, he watches a dream unfold before his eyes, one he never imagined. A story of discipline, art, and heartfelt emotions that will truly touch your heart. Subscribe to our channel, hit the like button, and let us know in the comments where you're watching from. The Back Bay neighborhood of Boston woke early, filled with executives hurrying toward their offices and the discreet hum of tree-lined streets. In Richard Coleman's glass and concrete penthouse, the day also began on schedule. At 6:30, the alarm rang, breakfast was served, and by 7, Richard was already leafing through reports from the law firm he chaired, with the same seriousness he brought to defending clients in court. At 41, widowed for 5 years, he had turned his home into an extension of the office, maintaining rigid routines with little room for improvisation. Emma, his 8-year-old daughter, followed a similar schedule, with set times for homework, reading, and even play. Everything appeared to run perfectly, but behind the discipline lingered a void time had not filled: the absence of her mother. Emma grew up quietly, finding refuge in dance videos she secretly watched on her tablet, imitating the steps in front of the mirror, and keeping in a box the memories of her mother, like the old music box that played a Tchaikovsky melody. The family's housekeeper, Mrs. Green, had been a pillar of order since Richard's wife passed away. But when she announced she was leaving Boston to move closer to her grandchildren, the meticulous structure of the home collapsed. The businessman, accustomed to managing million-dollar crises, realized that in his own house he lacked the predictability he demanded at work. Meetings piled up, hearings loomed, and Emma needed someone to keep pace with her. That was when the name Julia Morgan appeared, 34, an educator with experience in high-profile families. Her resume spoke of organization, teaching skills, and patience, but left out one detail that would shape the course of this story. Julia had once been a promising ballerina, forced to abandon the stage after an Achilles tendon injury. Her artistic past remained hidden, a secret she never intended to share, but one that would inevitably come to light. At their first meeting, Richard welcomed Julia into his private office inside the penthouse. The setting reflected his personality: shelves lined with law books, framed certificates, and awards from cases won. He laid out his expectations clearly: discipline, punctuality, discretion. His daughter, he explained, needed to prepare to follow in his footsteps in the legal world, and nothing outside that plan should distract her. Julia listened attentively, taking notes on schedules, meals, and school responsibilities. She didn't promise to transform the girl, only to provide consistency and care. Richard, used to formal answers, appreciated her clarity and decided to give her a chance. At the end of the interview, he asked her to spend an afternoon with Emma as a trial run. For him, it was just another hire. For Julia, it was the beginning of a chapter that would blend care, discipline, and the recovery of something she believed she had lost forever. Julia's first interaction with Emma took place in the living room, bathed in light from the large windows overlooking the Charles River. Julia crouched down to the girl's level and asked simple questions about her favorite subjects, foods, and music. Emma answered briefly, shyly, but her eyes lit up when the conversation turned to her tablet. Julia quickly noticed the search history: names of classical ballets, clips of famous performances, photos of ballerinas on stage. She recognized titles like Coppelia and La Bayadere and commented naturally. Emma lifted her head in surprise, as if she had finally found someone who spoke her language. Richard, watching from a distance, noted the immediate connection, though he didn't understand why. For him, what mattered was that Emma showed no resistance to finishing her homework or organizing her school materials that afternoon. Julia handled the trial with efficiency. She helped Emma work through math problems, prepared a simple snack of fruit and a light sandwich, and took her on a walk through the Boston Public Garden. Back at the penthouse, she carefully documented Emma's routine in a notebook, noting schedules, behavior, and concentration. Richard read it carefully and approved of its objectivity, as if reviewing a legal report. What he failed to notice was that, in reorganizing Emma's room, Julia had quietly created a more functional study space and, at the same time, a small corner where the girl could practice her steps in front of the mirror. Emma smiled when she saw the mirror repositioned and the music box placed near the window. Julia had given form to what the girl had been hiding. Without breaking the rules her father had imposed in the days that followed, Julia's presence began to transform the household routine. Emma started completing her homework more quickly, stopped making excuses to postpone her bath, and seemed more willing to talk at mealtimes. Richard, who observed everything as if assessing performance, praised the new hire for her efficiency. What he didn't realize was that his daughter's improved mood was tied not only to discipline, but also to the space Julia allowed for small expressions of her secret passion for dance. Julia managed to balance both sides, delivering meticulous reports to the father while subtly nurturing the daughter's dreams with stretches and simple exercises. Emma's hidden stage, once confined to her imagination, was beginning to take shape within her own home, even if Richard had no idea what was unfolding before his eyes. The new routine seemed to be settling in quietly, and Emma was beginning to respond with more energy to her daily activities. Julia stayed close to her every move, sometimes as a patient guide during schoolwork, other times as a companion in small discoveries beyond books. At breakfast, she served crisp toast and warm milk, encouraging the girl to talk about her lessons. On walks, she held Emma's hand through the Boston Common, pointing out details that sparked curiosity. The way light reflected on the trees, the distant sound of street musicians, the rhythm of joggers' feet rushing past. Emma observed in silence at first, but soon began asking questions, testing the trust she felt with her new caretaker. Richard, always attentive to schedules, noticed only that his daughter was less resistant when it came to her obligations. Without seeing the source of the change, one afternoon, after Emma had finished her math homework, Julia suggested a different challenge. "Let's play a balance game," she said, placing a thin book on the girl's head and asking her to walk across the room without letting it fall. Emma laughed, stumbled, and tried again. Julia then added arm movements, almost like wings, to help with posture. Emma grew more focused and eventually made it to the door. By the end, she was breathless, but her eyes shone with a new light. What seemed like play was, in fact, a simple foundational exercise for dance. But Julia never called it that, she simply guided her. Emma asked to repeat the game the next day, and Julia recorded it in her notebook as a coordination and focus activity. To Emma, that small gesture felt like opening a secret door to a world she had only imagined. Her interest became even clearer one evening when, as Julia was making the bed, Emma pulled a stack of magazine and newspaper clippings from under her pillow. They were photos of ballerinas, reviews of performances, and old program notes. With a shy look, she showed how she copied the poses by herself, comparing her reflection in the mirror. Julia sat beside her, listened intently, and simply remarked that she could see discipline and talent in her attempts. She made no promises, no grand plans, only validated Emma's effort, telling her that with patience, her practice could improve. Emma blushed, smiling as she tucked the clippings back under the pillow, but the moment was enough to create a bond of trust between them. Richard, unaware of these exchanges, carried on with days filled by meetings, client lunches, and court hearings. The little time he spent at home was enough to notice Emma was more cooperative, and for him that was sufficient. One evening, between phone calls, he commented that Julia had restored the order he valued in the house. Julia thanked him, keeping her tone neutral never revealing the content of her private talks with Emma. For her, it was crucial not to stir conflict too soon, respecting the boundaries Richard had set. The balance was delicate, encouraging Emma without challenging the father's authority. So far, she managed to navigate both fronts calmly, without raising suspicion. As weeks went by, Julia added small stretching routines before study sessions, calling them breaks to stretch the body. Emma eagerly followed, repeating the movements until her legs felt firm. Gradually, her gestures grew more coordinated, and her fascination deepened. Still, everything was framed as a game, without openly naming it as dance. Julia knew that any clear sign might provoke immediate resistance from Richard, and she had no desire to jeopardize the stability she had worked to establish. Emma, meanwhile, kept her excitement to herself, as if the secrecy made her discoveries even sweeter. One cold afternoon, after returning from a walk, Emma finally gathered the courage to ask if she could one day visit a ballet school. The question lingered in the air, but Julia didn't give a definitive answer. She only said that talking to her father would be the first step, and that everything had its time. Emma nodded quietly, gripping the caretaker's hand more tightly. For her, just voicing the wish was already a leap forward. For Julia, it was confirmation that beneath the rigid routine burned a flame that could not be extinguished. Neither of them knew yet how that desire would collide with Richard's vision, as he continued to believe his daughter's future should follow the same path that had crowned him in the courtroom. A light rain was falling over Boston that afternoon when Richard decided to end work earlier than usual. The penthouse, accustomed to receiving him only at night, felt different with his unexpected arrival. As he walked down the hallway, he heard laughter coming from the living room and followed the sound in silence, curious. When he opened the door, he found Emma in the middle of the rug, arms lifted in a position that resembled classical movements, while Julia guided her with calm gestures and subtle corrections of posture. The girl was focused, putting in effort, unaware of her father's presence. Richard stood still for a few seconds, watching, until Emma spun and noticed him. The smile vanished from her face instantly, and the atmosphere, once light, grew tense. Julia sensed the unease and straightened, fully aware the moment wouldn't be received easily. Richard closed the folder he carried and, with the firm tone he used in court, instructed Emma to go to her room and finish her homework. The girl obeyed silently, her eyes still wet with surprise. Alone with Julia in the room, the air shifted. The latter asked directly what was happening, reminding her that he had hired a caregiver, not a dance instructor. Julia kept her composure and explained that the exercises were intended to improve Emma's posture, focus, and confidence, though she never once used the word ballet. Richard, however, couldn't overlook the fact that his daughter's movements were typical of classical dance, and he accused Julia of overstepping boundaries he had never authorized. The discussion grew more intense when Julia revealed she understood the subject because she had once been a professional ballerina before an injury forced her off the stage. She explained matter-of-factly, without dramatics, how she had dedicated years of her life to dance and, after the accident, sought new ways to work with children. Richard reacted with suspicion, interpreting her omission as a lack of transparency. To him, the house was meant to be a place of security and predictability, and Julia's artistic past sounded like a door to unwanted distractions. He demanded to know why she hadn't disclosed this in her interview, and Julia replied that she hadn't considered it relevant to the position of caregiver, since her role was to guide Emma through her daily routine. Emma, listening from her room, held her mother's music box tightly against her chest. The sound of tense voices made her anxious, and tears began to roll down her cheeks. When the door opened and Richard stepped in, he found his daughter visibly shaken. He tried to soothe her, but Emma, in a rare moment of defiance, asked him not to send Julia away. In simple words, she told him she hadn't felt this happy at home since her mother's passing. The impact of her statement was immediate, leaving Richard momentarily speechless as he absorbed the weight of what she said. Even then, he offered no guarantees, only saying he would think about it. In the living room, Julia gathered her belongings, fully aware she could be dismissed at any moment. She knew she had crossed an invisible line, even if her intentions were only to support the girl. The once orderly household now carried a new tension. Richard, used to controlling every aspect of life around him, felt something slipping through his grasp. His daughter's genuine desire, something that could not be measured in reports or spreadsheets. Dinner that night unfolded in silence, with Emma pushing food around her plate and Richard keeping his eyes fixed on the papers beside his. The night ended without warm goodnights. Julia, retreating to her room, reflected on the fine line between caring and interfering. Emma fell asleep late, still unsure of what the next day would bring. Richard, seated in his office, spent hours staring at his computer without progress on any case. The scene he had witnessed earlier replayed in his mind, along with his daughter's words. The conflict was no longer in a courtroom, but within the walls of his own home, where the laws he valued so deeply no longer seemed enough to manage what was at stake. Richard woke early that morning, but his meticulous routine felt out of order. The breakfast prepared by the maid went untouched, and the stack of newspapers on the table remained unread. The latter, so used to having immediate answers to complex problems, now found himself trapped in a dilemma that couldn't be solved with legal arguments. The image of Emma smiling as she danced under Julia's guidance replayed in his mind, along with his daughter's plea not to let the nanny go. That request carried the weight of something undeniable. For the first time in years, Richard searched for information outside his field. At his computer, he typed simple phrases about ballet careers, dance schools in Boston, and the discipline required of dancers. What he found was not the portrait of a frivolous pastime, but a structured universe, with rigor and tradition comparable to the legal world he so respected. The following hours were filled with readings that dismantled his assumptions. He discovered stories of dancers who, from childhood, balanced intensive training with formal education, achieving international recognition. He realized there was more than performances and stages. There were scholarships, solid careers, even academic roles tied to dance. The more he read, the more he became convinced that his judgment had been hasty. The realization that he might be limiting his daughter out of fear began to weigh heavily on him. When Julia arrived to prepare Emma's breakfast, Richard called her into his office. His tone was still formal, though less defensive. He admitted he had reacted harshly and asked her to explain more thoroughly what she was doing with his daughter, without holding anything back. Julia stayed calm, detailing each exercise and every adapted game, clarifying that the purpose was to improve focus, posture, and confidence. The conversation unfolded respectfully. Julia, unlike what Richard expected, did not try to persuade him of ballet's importance. She simply stated facts, shared her personal experience, and highlighted the discipline dance demanded. She spoke of long hours of training, the need for concentration, and the resilience required to face setbacks. Richard listened without interruption, weighing every word as if he were hearing sworn testimony. At the end, he took a deep breath and admitted he needed to reconsider his stance. Though still uneasy, he said he was willing to see this world firsthand to understand what it might mean for Emma's life. For the first time, he did not issue a verdict but left room for possibility. Julia agreed to provide something concrete and suggested taking Emma to a respected ballet school in the city. Emma entered the office shortly after, still in her pajamas, clutching her mother's music box. Her father asked her to sit, and in a steady tone told her he was willing to take her to a dance school, as long as she remained committed to her academic studies. The girl's eyes filled with hope. She didn't cheer or rush into his arms. She simply held the music box tighter and smiled quietly, as if she had finally been given permission to dream. Julia observed cautiously, without intervening. For Emma, the news felt like a door long locked had finally opened. For Richard, it was a controlled step, though one still wrapped in uncertainty. That same afternoon, Julia contacted the school run by Madame Ivana Petrov, one of Boston's most established institutions. The Russian-born director was known for her rigor and her ability to spot talent in children. She scheduled an initial evaluation for the following week. Julia relayed the news clearly to Richard, also requesting that he attend so he could see firsthand what was taught. The lawyer agreed, convinced that he needed to engage more closely with his daughter's world, even if it meant stepping into unfamiliar territory. When Emma learned of the visit, she spent the following days in quiet anticipation, practicing steps in front of her mirror but holding back, worried that too much enthusiasm might cause her father to change his mind. The week passed under a hush of preparation. Emma completed her schoolwork efficiently, as if each assignment were a key to keeping the dream of visiting the ballet school alive. Richard maintained his demanding schedule, but set aside moments to ask his daughter briefly about her day. Julia oversaw everything, ensuring a balance between discipline and small allowances. The home, once defined only by rigidity, began to breathe differently. There were no guarantees, no promises of the future, only the tangible expectation of an encounter that could reshape the family's routine. As the day of the evaluation drew near, each of them faced the growing anticipation in their own way. Emma with quiet hope, Julia with the calm of experience, and Richard with the skepticism of a man learning to look beyond the limits of his own world. Madame Ivana Petrov's school stood on a busy street in Boston, yet stepping into the hall felt like crossing a portal into another world. The polished wooden floor reflected the light from tall windows, and the faint scent of resin mixed with the distant sound of a piano guiding another class. Richard, more familiar with courtrooms and marble offices, surveyed the place with suspicion, arms crossed and posture rigid, assessing rather than admiring. Emma, in contrast, hurried forward, her eyes darting to every detail. The bars mounted along the walls, the mirrors multiplying movements, the rows of slippers lined up near the small stage. Julia accompanied her, calm but attentive to the girl's nerves. When Madame Ivana appeared, hair pulled tightly into a perfect bun and her voice firm with a thick accent, the atmosphere grew even more imposing. The evaluation began without ceremony. Madame Ivana asked Emma to perform simple exercises of coordination, posture, and balance. Richard remained seated in the back, silent, while Julia encouraged the girl with discreet gestures. Though timid at first, Emma quickly revealed natural control of her body and musicality. She followed the commands attentively, adjusting each detail with unusual discipline for her age. Madame Ivana stopped her a few times to correct positions, but instead of reprimanding, praised her for absorbing instructions so quickly. Richard, though not technically versed, noticed his daughter's focus and the way she seemed transformed by the music. Expecting an amateur display, he instead saw something that challenged his pragmatic view of the world. At the end of the evaluation, Madame Ivana invited the three into her office. She spoke clearly, explaining that Emma possessed not only aptitude but also rare sensitivity. She recommended immediate enrollment with 3 weekly classes, emphasizing that the environment of dance demanded commitment equal to the most traditional careers. Richard listened carefully, still hesitant, but could not ignore the master's conviction. Julia stayed quiet, noting every detail, while Emma waited anxiously for a decision. After a long pause, Richard agreed on the condition that her academic grades remain high. Emma accepted at once, relieved to finally receive the permission she had long wished for. In the days that followed, the household adjusted to the new schedule. Tuesdays, Thursdays, and Saturdays were now dedicated to ballet, and Julia arranged Emma's agenda so homework and rehearsals would not overlap. Richard, though not present at every class, tracked progress through Julia's notes and his daughter's own excited accounts. Emma's enthusiasm was unmistakable. She practiced steps down the hallway, spoke with shining eyes about her classmates, and even staged little performances for Julia during afternoon breaks. The home, once dominated by stacks of legal documents and the constant buzz of Richard's phone, now carried the echo of rehearsal music, gradually weaving itself into the family's routine. Over time, Julia's role expanded. Impressed by her expertise and keen eye, Madame Ivana offered her a position as assistant teacher for beginner classes. The proposal surprised Julia, reigniting memories of a past she thought long behind her. She accepted cautiously, splitting her time between guiding Emma and supporting the school. For Richard, the news stirred mixed feelings. On one hand, he recognized Julia's competence and the positive influence she had on his daughter. On the other, he realized that the bond between them was deepening, extending beyond professional boundaries. With each passing day, Julia's presence shaped not only Emma's growth but also the growing sense of balance within the household. Emma's first official performance was scheduled for the school's auditorium. Julia helped her prepare, correcting details with patience, while Richard watched quietly from the back. The girl rehearsed a simple variation, but executed every step with dedication and joy. On the evening of the recital, dressed in a light skirt and brand new slippers, Emma stepped onto the stage before a modest but meaningful audience. Richard, seated in the crowd, felt his heart race in a way it hadn't in years. As the music began and Emma moved with ease, he didn't just see his daughter dancing. He saw someone finding her place in the world, in a way no law book could ever provide. When the performance ended, the applause was warm, and Emma ran, radiant, into the arms of her father and Julia. That moment sealed a transformation that could no longer be ignored. The night of the recital carried a different kind of silence in the car on the way home. Emma, still holding her costume on her lap and clutching the flowers in her arms, couldn't stop smiling. The sparkle in her eyes reflected something far greater than a simple performance. It was the certainty of having found a place in the world that truly made sense to her. Richard, behind the wheel, watched his daughter through the rearview mirror with an expression that blended relief and pride, emotions he rarely allowed to surface. No report or award could equal the value of that moment. Julia, seated beside him, kept a quiet sense of fulfillment within. It wasn't just about Emma's performance, but the proof that the small seed planted in a simple gesture had bloomed out in the days that followed. The Coleman household began to reorganize. After Madame Ivana's formal offer, Julia chose to commit solely to the dance school. She explained her decision openly to Richard, who listened in silence before nodding in agreement. He understood that her role had already gone beyond being a nanny. Julia now had a rightful place as a teacher, able to share her experience with many children, Emma included. To maintain balance at home, Richard hired a new caretaker recommended by Julia, who oversaw Emma's domestic routine and academic discipline. Emma accepted the change easily, comforted by the knowledge that Julia would still be part of the place that mattered most to her. Classes at the school became the highlight of Emma's week. Under Julia's guidance, she approached every exercise with both discipline and joy. Each correction was absorbed carefully, and every word of praise fueled her confidence. To Emma, Julia was more than a teacher. She was someone who genuinely believed in her potential. Richard often watched a rehearsal quietly from the back of the room, noticing with each visit how much his daughter was improving. A man trained to evaluate arguments, he began to see that there was also a structure to dance: repetition, rigor, focus, perseverance. These elements, he realized, made his daughter's efforts just as valuable as any academic achievement. For Julia, Each day in the studio felt like reconnecting with herself. What once held painful memories of her injury now became a source of joy. Guiding Emma and the other children reignited her love for the art, but without the weight of the personal pressure that had marked her interrupted career. There was pride, of course, but also gratitude for the chance to turn her past experience into something meaningful. Watching Emma shine at such a young age reassured Julia that nothing she had endured had been in vain. When the girl ran to her after rehearsals to share news, Julia felt the old cycle of pain transform into a cycle of purpose and joy. At home, Richard noticed a different Emma waiting for him after long workdays. She eagerly shared stories of new steps, corrections from class, and dreams of future performances. He listened, smiled, and even without understanding every technical term, allowed himself to be carried by her excitement. His pride grew with every conversation, and in his office, beside the shelves of legal achievements, he cleared space for Emma's certificates and stage photos. To him, those mementos symbolized more than his daughter's personal successes. They were proof he had made the right choice in letting her follow what truly brought her happiness. One sunny afternoon, after an open rehearsal at the school, Richard waited for Emma to finish and then lifted her into his arms with a firm embrace he hadn't given in years. She laughed loudly, holding her father's face in both hands, while Julia watched from a distance with a calm, satisfied smile. There were no speeches or promises, only the clear sense that each had found their place. Emma on the stage she had always dreamed of, Richard as the proud and supportive father, and Julia rediscovering her vocation, grateful for having given the first gentle push that reshaped the family's life. What once seemed an irreconcilable conflict had become the foundation of a new harmony built step by step, like a well-rehearsed dance. The end. So, what did you think of this story? Don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel to keep enjoying stories like this one. See you next time.